Personal friends have done it. Members of Congress have sworn in the vice president. And are those members of the Supreme Court wearing earmuffs?
Justice Breyer was, yes.
We've pointed out that Senator Obama was one of, 22 Democratic senators not to vote for the confirmation of
Chief Justice Roberts. That's right.
That's right.
Both Senator Biden and Senator Obama voted against his confirmation.
Overarching philosophy was his reason.
I believe he will be the first president to be sworn in by a Chief Justice who he voted against.
But there have been a number of times when there were sort of testy relationships. Justice Rehnquist, when he swore in President Clinton, he had just issued a decision in the Paula Jones case, which eventually led to the impeachment proceedings against him. And Chief Justice Taney swore in Abraham Lincoln, and they did not. He'd been in Chief Justice for 25 years or so, and did not agree with Abraham Lincoln on the subject of emancipation, and swore him in. It was not a good relationship they had.
Of course, that's retired Justice Sandra Day O'Connor.
Justice Rehnquist, 4 years ago, swore in George Bush, got out of a sickbed to get there, and just months later passed away. They seem to be running just a little bit behind. If they were on schedule, according to my TikTok, they would be introducing the former president, George H.W. Bush, and Mrs. Bush.
And we hear that the president-elect's speech will be about 15 to 20 minutes. I think that's about average for a presidential speech. The longest we all know was almost 2 hours. William Henry Harrison. The shortest, perhaps, George Washington, about a minute for 135 words.
Which is essentially, let's get back to work.
And you know, when we were talking to transition aides about this speech, they said, and usually you try to lower expectations a little bit for the speech, and certainly that's what President-elect Obama was trying to do, but they were telling us yesterday that when he finally bore down on it last weekend, it came very easily to him, that he had no writer's block, no trouble at all in that final weekend.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect's cabinet and agency designees.
Well, I think that's an important point. First of all, expectations are so high for this speech, and they are enormously high because of, A, the time. There's Leon Panetta, who was a former White House Chief of Staff under President Clinton, former congressman from California, designate CIA director.
Thank you.
And because so much of Barack Obama's political career has been based on his speeches. From that speech he gave to the Democratic Convention back in 2004 through his Susan Rice, who will be the UN ambassador.
But he is a writer, and he looks at himself as a writer. He wrote the 2 books, both of which sell so well still, and wrote them himself, and we understand this speech is his. Largely. He had a lot of help from his speechwriter, Jon Favreau, who wrote one draft that was delivered in December, another one in January, but he took it over last weekend, and as they say, every word is his. They also consulted with some historians like David McCullough, who of course wrote the biographies of Harry Truman and John Adams, Doris Kearns Goodwin and Richard Goodwin. They consulted with them as well, but they do emphasize this is Barack Obama's speech first and foremost. Michael Waldman is with us, who has had a hand in a lot of speech writing for presidents himself. And Michael, as we were talking about the expectations of all of this, I don't remember expectations ever being so high for an inaugural address, do you?
No, these speeches often are not that good and certainly are not well remembered, but Barack Obama has shown in a way that the kind of speech that he's so good at giving is like an inaugural address. He's wonderful at summoning the country's history and ideals, and what we know, unfortunately, is that when there's a crisis, the words matter a lot more, and so he has a chance to try to turn the country's mood around with a speech like this and give it a positive sense of momentum And in a few short minutes, he's going to try to do that.
It's interesting. I went back, as I suppose many people in our business did, and read a lot of the previous inaugural addresses, and I was very struck, Michael, by some parallels to Ronald Reagan's, strangely enough, first inaugural address, when he talked about the economy being in such terrible trouble and how we could bring ourselves out of a very difficult economic situation. But then, of course, he went in a totally different direction and said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And I think you may hear some very similar themes from Barack Obama today, but then going in a different direction than did Ronald Reagan back in 1981.
Well, you're exactly right. Reagan summoned the plucky individualism of individual Americans, and he said government is not the solution, government is the problem. And that speech and that very clear, almost ideological declaration marked the beginning of decades, in effect, of conservative dominance over American political life. Now, with the economy in crisis and already the rescue plan for the banks and the stimulus in the works, it's very hard to see government as the problem necessarily, and probably President Obama, when he takes the oath, will have a chance to put a new explanation on the role of government, in effect, to debate over the years with Ronald Reagan.
It's funny you brought up that line, and Michael, you of course worked on the 1996 inaugural where Bill Clinton answered that line from Ronald Reagan and said government is not the problem, government is not the solution, we are the solution. And one of the things to watch for, I think, today is, as you're talking about, how does Barack Obama discuss the role of government, and does he enter that conversation with Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton directly?
You know, these presidents, they talked about Richard Nixon talking to the portraits in his last days in the White House. I think presidents are often talking to the portraits and expecting the portraits to talk back. Presidents dialogue with each other over the years about issues of race, about the role of government, about the country's place in the world. And this certainly is a speech filled with portent, and this may be one of those moments.
I wonder, too, about walking that fine line of tone, gravity of the situation economically in this country, but also the optimism that presidents must project.
Well, it's really true that on the one hand, a president wants to tell the story and tell the truth to the public, but also to convey confidence. And those are the things we remember from inaugural addresses. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Action now. Now, what people remember about Roosevelt's speech, his first speech in 1933, is that the lines that drew the greatest applause were not the polished rhetoric that we might remember now, but when he pledged action and even pledged to take dictatorial power if Congress wouldn't pass his economic plan. I don't think we're going to hear quite that, but this is not only words to be chiseled on the marble walls of the Obama Presidential Library. In a way, it's a political speech, too. It's got to give some momentum to his program.
Talking to Michael Waldman, who was the director of speechwriting for Bill Clinton from 1995 to 1999. But as we talk to him, we see three former vice presidents and their wives coming in, having been introduced. Walter Mondale, and then Dan Quayle, who's gotten some gray hairs since he was in Washington, and Al Gore. And you wonder what must be going through his mind, because had he gotten a second term, had he been elected president in the first place in the year 2000, and then gotten a second term, he would be there as the outgoing president of the United States. So close, we all remember the long election of the year 2000. Diane, I think we were on the air every day talking about the latest turns and twists. And
bittersweet on the